Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have Frank Bruni back with us. We'll chat with Frank in just a second, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe. And you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Frank Bruni has been a prominent journalist for more than 3 decades, including more than 25 years at the New York Times, in roles as diverse as op-ed columnist, White House correspondent, Rome bureau chief, and chief restaurant critic. He is the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers. In July 2021, he became a full professor at Duke University, teaching in the School of Public Policy. He currently writes his popular weekly newsletter for the Times and produces additional essays as one of the newspaper's contributing opinion writers. Frank, welcome back into the back room.
Great to be here.
So there's a lot to discuss in these last 10 days or so. I want to start off with your opinion piece from the Times last week titled Democrats, Let's Get Real About Why Harris Lost. So give us the gist of why Harris lost, in your opinion.
Well, I think the gist of why she lost is that she was in most ways destined to lose. And what I mean by that is if you look in any other election before this one, in any election where you would take Donald Trump out of the equation and the assumptions made about how many Americans would find him, too offensive, whatever, to inhabit the presidency again, if you look at right track, wrong track numbers, how many Americans, the overwhelming majority of Americans who were not feeling good about the country's current station and its direction. If you looked at what they were saying about the economy, and we know it has for decades now been the economy stupid. If you look at all of that, Kamala Harris didn't really have much of a chance. And it was a chance that was worsened by the fact that it was a shotgun candidacy. There were a lot of voters who felt, understandably, that she was inhabiting the nomination without voters, without Democrats, without anyone having had much of a say in it. You put all of that together with external conditions, and I think, again, if it hadn't been that there was a feeling that America would not suffer Donald Trump again, I don't think anyone would have thought she was in it to begin with. And that's the big picture, and that's what needs to be factored in first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. So we went through this situation with Joe Biden back in June and July, especially after the debate. He eventually withdrew from the race. She took over in a very truncated campaign. Immediately there was euphoria and joy. Did we just get drunk on the euphoria and joy? Is that really what the problem was, that we were so full of our own enthusiasm and excitement, almost to orgasmic levels, for crying out loud, that we forgot to focus on the things that Donald Trump was very, very masterfully focusing on?
I think that's very, very well said. I think that's exactly the case. I mean, what it was enormous relief. Listen, I suppose if we comb the internet or if we kind of sit and listen long enough, we'll find someone saying, wait, maybe if Joe Biden hadn't dropped out, he would have won. I think that's bunk. It was clear to Americans that Joe Biden had faded profoundly. Mm-hmm. I think because by the time he dropped out, almost anybody in their right mind had accepted that he did not have a tenable reelection campaign, and he was cruising toward a defeat that I think would have been much, much worse than Kamala Harris's defeat. I think there was such enormous relief. It was like we'd gone, if you were a Democrat, if you were someone, or if you're not a Democrat, if you were anyone who believed that Trump was not a good president and shouldn't be president again, you went in the Biden to Harris transition from no hope to at least some hope. And that at least some hope, I think, got tilled and it flowered into the joy you mentioned. But the joy was never, the joy was real in and of itself, but it was never aligned with what her chances really were of winning the election.
I try to look at things through the lens of comedy because it's what keeps me sane. And so what you're saying and what your piece was and what the reality was, it reminds me of that scene from the Jim Carrey movie Dumb and Dumber, where he says to Lauren Archer, what are the chances of a guy like me getting a girl like you? And she goes, 1,000,000 to 1. And he looks at her and he goes, so there's a chance. Like, that's the essence. That's the essence of what you just said. Like, we just focused on that analogy. 1 in a million,
Well, what else were we going to do? I mean, it's it seems silly in retrospect in the sense that we set ourselves up for the profound disappointment. If you did not want Trump reelected, you set yourself up for the profound disappointment of late on the night of the 5th or early on the morning of the 6th. But it's utterly understandable. What was the alternative? To say, okay, we have no chance. Let's just all go home and begin to mourn today. You never know what's going to happen in an election. And there were moments, I have to say, in the final weeks where some of the things Trump was saying and doing, I had gone from being fairly convinced that he was cruising to election. And maybe it was because I wanted that sliver of hope. I preferred her to him. In those last weeks, some of the stuff he did, some of the stuff he said, some of the stuff J.D. Vance said, I thought, they may be actually taking victory and somehow wringing defeat from it. But that was silly of me, or that was stupid of me, because I kind of knew at a deeper level that the fundamentals were what we talked about a moment ago. And no matter how vulgar a comment Trump or Vance might make from the stage, no matter how, forgive my language, batshit crazy that Madison Square Garden rally was, those fundamentals were not changed by that. And the other thing, and I wrote this in the piece you mentioned, is we forget, I mean, we meaning my kind, people who are kind of swimming in journalism and looking at the developments every hour, every minute. We forget how many voters actually don't see all that stuff. I guarantee you there were many voters who knew not a single detail about the Madison Square Garden rally. One of the greatest flaws of political analysis and of political analysts like myself is we're so interested in kind of taking in all this information and having the information, the new information, the nuanced information, the layers of information mean something, that we forget that our level of attention to and knowledge of what's going on puts us so far away from the typical voter that in that distance is an inevitable misunderstanding of what's motivating that voter and what that voter's going to do.
So we are coastal elites.
Yeah, I mean, but they don't have to be on the coast. I know plenty of coastal elites who are heartland elites or, windy city elites. But I don't like the word elites because, it has so many connotations that I think are unfair. But we're out of touch. We're out of touch. We're by dint of how much information we take in every day, by dint of us making our living in that realm of information, we are not representative and we are not tuned in to the people who ultimately decide this election or any election.
No, it's so true what you're saying. And I'm trying now to drill this into my own head because we do tend to live in a bubble. I remember many years ago when Jay Leno had his Tonight Show, he would do a man on the street segment once in a while. And it was around an election, I forget which one. And he went on the street and in the course of talking to this one woman, he said, "Who's the vice president, ma'am?" And she said, "Hillary Clinton." And he goes, "Oh, Hillary Clinton. What do you do for a living, ma'am?" And she goes, "I'm a teacher." And he goes, "Oh, you're a teacher." And that's when I realized not everybody is following this shit as closely as I am when teachers don't know who the vice president is. And I think in this election, more than anything, the more I think about it, the more I read stuff of yours and listen to other people, I think we were swirling in a vortex of our own bubble. And we just got
a little story.
Kicked in the nuts with the results.
Ouch. Let me tell you a little story that illustrates what we're talking about. And I just never forget this. This is going back to, I'm forgetting the year, but it was the year that Carly Fiorina was running for the Senate in California against Barbara Boxer, who was running for re-election. And I was following her around with enormous access to her because she needed media. It was a long shot candidacy. And I was riding around in the black Escalade or Suburban or whatever she and her husband were riding around as they campaigned across the state. And we had a stop in San Jose. And it was a beautiful sunny day, right? I think it was a weekend day. So most people, anyone, you wouldn't think most people would come to a political rally. And there was a rally of sorts at which different Republicans were taking the stage to talk. And I started walking among the rally goers thinking, oh, this is a great place to get some intelligent quotes from voters, because if they are not doing something fun outdoors, if they're not taking, relaxation time, if they've come with their lawn chairs to this place, and I found a couple who were sitting so close to the stage that it was clear they'd gotten there hours before. And they had political pennants and they had political buttons and they had all this swag. And I'm like, wow, these people are really on their game. And I said to them, "Hi, I'm Frank with the New York Times. I'm following around Carly Fiorina. I'm curious if you're coming here today And when you hear her, you're hearing someone you've already decided you support, or whether that's part of what you're figuring out. And the woman pauses really long and thoughtfully. And she said, we haven't decided between Carly Fiorina and Meg Whitman. And I said, today is your lucky day. Carly's running for Senate and Meg is running for governor. You can vote for both of them. That's the American voter.
Yeah, and that voter probably also hated Obamacare but loves ACA.
Exactly right. You got it.
So if you were at the DNC right now, what would you be telling them we need to do differently going forward?
I would say, and I mean all of this sort of metaphorically and in a cheeky sense, not a literal one. I would say, hey, how about for 2028, we don't nominate a lawyer? Do you know, and I didn't realize this until I was researching something I wrote recently, I knew it was nonstop lawyers. Do you know that the last Democratic nominee who had not been to law school was Jimmy Carter that long ago? That's half a century ago.
Well, this is the subject of your new piece, which I do want to talk with you in a second about specifically, because I find it fascinating, the premise you're operating from. But just moving aside from the candidates per se,
okay.
As a party, strategically, whether it's ground game, advertising, you name it, putting this election under a microscope and saying that was wrong, this is what you got to do. What are those fundamental things that the party needs to do to course correct this disaster that was last week?
It needs to speak in the language that most voters use, and not in terms like Latinx and BIPOC. And I'm using that sort of woke stuff as an example, but you could go much wider with the way Democrats talk. And James Carville's been harping on this for years, and he's absolutely right about this. Democrats need to learn to talk so that they can then message like normal people, and not like people with 1 foot or actually 8 of their 10 toes in academia and in theory and that sort of stuff. And some Democrats do that and do it very well, but I don't think they are the majority of the party, and they're not really kind of driving the party. I think Democrats need to realize that no issue trumps the economy for people. Democracy, that sounds very abstract and theoretical to people. Even abortion, one of the things the party forgot that we kind of knew, but they forgot, is when you ask voters in a discrete referendum that's just about abortion what they want, it's very clear that most people want a certain level of abortion rights in the country. They do not want abortion banned, or they don't want a 6-week restriction. When people are making a choice in an election for a candidate who's dealing with all sorts of issues, you can't bet that their abortion position is going to drive their vote. I would tell Democrats that as well.
And it's interesting. You mentioned Carville. I'm a huge fan of Carville. And he infamously, like you said, coined the phrase, it's the economy stupid. Carville, though, in your newspaper, wrote an opinion piece right before the election guaranteeing Kamala Harris's victory.
I do not believe for a nanosecond that Carville believed what he wrote in that piece. Even as I read that piece, I felt I understood it perfectly. But
days later, he was on some show. Days later, after that, he said, I am more confident today than I was several days ago when I wrote that piece.
I think that whole span was about trying to wish something into existence. And I think it gets really boring, and it brings on a lot of psychic distress to believe something that terrible is really going to happen. I think he was sort of trying to convince himself, and in the process will the reality that he preferred. I don't think in his heart of hearts, it was a kind of performance art, and it was a kind of psychological self-therapy. That's what I chalk it up to. I don't think he really believed that she was going to win, or that he was remotely as confident as he was pretending he was. He may have felt, like I did in the end, that there was a chance. And again, I think a lot of us who were watching that stuff that a lot of voters didn't see, in terms of, how in various ways Donald Trump seemed to be self-destructing in terms of his lack of discipline, in terms of vulgarity and that sort of stuff. Maybe that stuff gave him a real hope. But again, I don't think he really believed it.
So let's talk about your new piece. Newsom, Whitmer, Shapiro, 2024 could kill their 2028 dreams. This is striking such a chord with me because it's questioning how we nominate candidates in the Democratic Party. If we look at the 2 most successful Republicans in the last 40 years, one came out of film and one came out of TV, right? did they know something that we don't know yet? And this is the point of your piece. It's like, if you're a traditional politician right now and you think you're just going to move up the chain from the House to the White House or the Senate to the White, like, you might have to rethink that. So talk a little bit about that. And then I want to ask you about some of the names in particular and examples you've given as to what the future may look like for the party.
We are living in an era, and we have been for a couple of decades, where people are almost always going to vote for change over stasis. They're very attracted to change. They're very disgruntled. They're very dissatisfied. They're always hoping what's around the corner might be better than what they already have. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, an unconventional candidate who represents something truly different, who is kind of the choice you make instead of the obvious choice, instead of the status quo choice, instead of the heir apparent, that candidate is going to have a kind of power that someone else might not have. And we should throw into this discussion the fact that the last two-term Democratic president was Barack Obama. And yes, he was a sitting U.S. senator, which seems like a conventional springboard. But he was not the heir apparent. Hillary Clinton was supposed to be the nominee in 2008. He was the insurgent, and that had a lot to do with his success. So we should remember that. I do think that one of the lessons of Trump, and I hadn't thought so much in terms of Reagan, but you're right as well, even though Reagan was governor of California. So he had a kind of conventional bona fide there. But I think people love the promise of somebody who is not of the system, who is not reflexively going to perpetuate the system as is. And I think Democrats need to think about that. Kamala Harris was the polite choice. Biden bowed out so late, there could be no real primary. And what you've heard again and again is, I don't see how we nominate anybody but her. I don't see how we have time to do someone else. And I don't see how we do someone else without it looking offensive not to go to the vice president. Hillary Clinton in 2016, people had long been concerned before her 2008 campaign, certainly as a result of her 2008 campaign, had long been concerned about how well she really connected with voters, but she was owed. She had earned it. She had this dazzling resume. The Democratic Party needs to get away from that sort of propriety, because what Donald Trump has shown us is there's enormous power in not being proper at all.
Which is why I found your piece so interesting, is that you basically break down the 28 hopefuls into, I'll call it 3 buckets. The first bucket is the ones that everyone was talking about this year, right? The Shapiros, the Newsoms, and Gretchen Whitmer, that ilk. The second group are the more centrists, or still conventional, but people like Ruben Gallego, who hasn't even hit the Senate yet, but already, to me, kind of jumps to the top of the pack because of the party's problem in the Latino community and Arizona. And then you have this third group, which I love, again, because it speaks to what I'm sort of thinking these days, is that, and I quote you, who's to say that a prominent podcaster, by the way, I'm available if anybody's interested, wouldn't catch fire? Or a star athlete like LeBron James, or maybe someone like Mark Cuban, Mary Barra, GM, CEO. When you think about it, like, is that really where we're headed? Which is our true reality? Are we going to be staring down the barrel of that first group with Gavin and et cetera, no matter how much we think we might need somebody unconventional? Or is it going to be someone like a Ruben Gallego, or Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky, Roy Cooper of North Carolina, somebody more in the middle, J.B. Pritzker in Illinois, or Andrew Yang back, you mentioned him in your piece, or are we looking at like The Rock or George Clooney or somebody like that, or LeBron James? Which direction are we headed, in your opinion?
I think it depends entirely on how the next 2 years go, right? If it's a disaster, if the floating of Matt Gaetz as Attorney General and RFK, who doesn't believe in vaccines or fluoridated water or whatever, running the nation's health, if that's a preview of what the entire next 2 years is going to be like, we could be looking at a very conventional Democratic choice again. And we could be looking at one of those, Whitmer, Shapiro, et cetera, because it may well be that people are like, whoa, we really tried unconventional with Donald Trump, and this time around it got beyond crazy and never again. If the next 2 years are not a disaster, if he catches the right wave and the economy does well, et cetera, then I think we're looking quite possibly at an unconventional choice. And that could be, and we can't even come up with names because by dint of it, it will be someone we're not thinking of now. But, we've seen hints of that in the past. If you look back, We've had people like Tom Steyer and Andrew Yang and Marianne Williamson run in the Democratic primary, and all of them get more traction than someone might have once thought, if not nearly enough traction to get the nomination. I think someone of that kind, not one of those three, could end up getting enormous traction unless, as I said, the next 2 years are so bad, so chaotic, the economy tanks, et cetera, that it's like, whoa, we need a correction. We talk about elections as new beginnings, but they're in equal measure corrections for whatever needs correcting. And so it really, really depends on what kind of situation the country's in.
And what about people like Pete Buttigieg or AOC? You touched on this. Do they have a chance in this Democratic Party 4 years from now?
Well, I mean, I certainly think so. And in the case of Pete Buttigieg, we know that he has a chance because he did really, really well in the 2020 primaries. I mean, he won or tied in Iowa, depending on how you looked at it. He did very, very well, better than anyone thought he would, because he was campaigning as the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, right? What's interesting about him and AOC, and the reason they should not only be watched, but what works about them should be kind of studied. Both of them are fantastic communicators, not of the same kind. Both of them inspire in the people who admire them a kind of fervor, and they generate a kind of respect that is beyond the norm. Both of them know how to talk in a way that does not sound like it's coming. Kamala Harris was criticized, I think rightly, although again, remember how little time she had to put together this candidacy. And I think she did amazingly well. And God, I think she brought everything she had to it. And I thank her for that. But she was correctly criticized for being so scripted, for never being spontaneous. If you listen to AOC's interviews across time, if you listen to Pete Buttigieg's across time, even though they're utterly, utterly different people, they both have that spontaneity and that aura of authenticity that I think in this day and age, with media being so fractured, with everybody being so cynical, I think that is a currency more valuable than ever before. And so as people cycle onto our radar, and as we get a sense that they might be flirting, at least in their minds, with the idea of running, pay attention to how well they communicate and how they communicate. Because a Kamala Harris style, I don't think cuts it anymore. Pete and AOC have a different style.
We've seen now the attempts by two women, highly qualified women, to shatter what now appears to be a bulletproof glass ceiling, losing to the same maniac. Do we have a woman problem in this country? Like, it just seems so hard for a woman to break through because of the sexism and misogyny.
I think a woman could absolutely be elected president, and I think we have a sexism problem. I think both things are true. I don't think our sexism problem is so profound that it makes it impossible for a woman to win in, say, 2028. I think it makes the climb uphill a little steeper, but I think it's doable. The question, I think, is having lost two of the last three elections, presidential elections, and having both of those losses come with a woman nominee, I think the Democratic Party will be too spooked to nominate a woman again. And that may be a real misfortune, because let's say it is time for a more conventional candidate. Let's say things have been very chaotic. I think Gretchen Whitmer would be a formidable candidate. I think she would have been a more formidable candidate this time around than Kamala Harris. I don't know if she would have won, because the fundamentals we talked about earlier, those wouldn't have been changed. But I think the party is going to be very spooked, and I think it's a long shot that a woman gets the nomination in 2028, and that's a damn shame. But that is about, that's the reality at this point.
You write about Andrew Yang and you say, quote, "I wouldn't be surprised to see him and his pitch for universal basic income return in 2028. He was written off as a quack with that kind of thing, but given what we now know, he's kind of speaking the everyman's language on the street with that universal basic income proposal, is he not?
Absolutely. And I tell you, I was on a stage with him with a bunch of people in New York. I think it was last May. And Andrew Yang and former Representative Tim Ryan were sitting next to each other. There were like 9 of us on the stage. And they were talking about the challenges of working class Americans in the Midwest. They were talking about all of the economic stuff that just drove this election. And both of them were beyond eloquent on it, but not, and eloquent's not the right word. They spoke in a compelling, real, persuasive way. And when I put Andrew Yang's name in the piece, I was remembering that evening. I was remembering him on that stage, and I was remembering just how fluent and fluid he was in that particular economic conversation, the kind of economic conversation that just drove the outcome of this election. So I would not be at all surprised if he starts to kind of percolate, bubble up again.
Mm-hmm. And the last person I want to ask you about what you wrote about is Mark Cuban. We saw him getting very engaged in this election. He was almost like the Democratic yin to Trump's Musk yang, if you will, and probably would have had a fairly big role on some level in the Harris administration. So he's made his political aspirations clear on many levels. Do you think in 2028, again, it all depends, like you say, on how the economy goes. And so in a worst case scenario for Trump, if the landscape is ripe now for a new outsider disruptor type of candidate, Mark Cuban certainly seems like a pretty legit choice to me.
He might well be. I mean, we know that voters like the idea of someone who is an entrepreneur, who has had success outside of government, in the private sector. And I think someone like that is always attractive. We've never seen him campaign. Like, we've seen him campaign for other people, but we've never seen him do the sorts of interviews that a candidate has to do and all of that. And so that we don't know. The jury's out on that. But in theory, on paper, here's the other thing, though, I think we need to keep in mind. You were talking about how Trump will be judged, and I was talking about a bad economy and what that might mean, et cetera. There's now a whole X factor in all of this, as a whole variable, which is Trump spins reality in a way that raises the question of how accountable he'll really be, how answerable he'll really be.
Yep.
He could have a miserable year with the economy for the next year. Would he be able to use this fractured media environment and the ability to kind of speak to people and appoint scapegoats and tell them, no, the reality the media is talking about, don't believe that, or sure, these numbers are these numbers, but it's not anything I've done. It's actually the fault of this person, that reality. I think we're going to see whether we can actually have a political conversation and make political adjustments that are grounded in truth.
Well, you're talking about the erosion or disappearance of truth and reality and facts. And that is the number one concern of mine, that reality is not reality anymore. But my last question on Cuban, it seems like there's been a real paradigm shift with the standards of voters or the average working man and woman. There was a time not that long ago that these folks would detest billionaires. Now it's like this crazy admiration. I don't know what it is, but when did the working man and woman fall in love with billionaires? Because it seems bonkers to me.
I don't know, but it's happened before. It has happened periodically for a while, and it's happened all over the globe. So I'm talking to you as someone who, for the 2 years that I was stationed in Rome for the Times, and was was the person who covered Italy for the Times, those 2 years, Silvio Berlusconi was prime minister, and he was a progenitor of Trump, if ever there was one. His empire was a media empire, et cetera. I don't know why it's so prevalent today, but throughout history, there have been moments when people have thought anyone who amassed a fortune like that must have some real knowledge, some real intellect, some real secrets. And let's see if they can transfer whatever that gift is to the political arena and make my life better. And there's also a part of people that they look at someone like that and they say, that's who, with a few lucky breaks, I could be. They don't always look at someone at that economic altitude and say, I resent that person's fortune. Because if they resent it, they're saying, I will never be there. I could never be there. And that's not something a lot of people say to themselves. Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned Berlusconi. I remember when he was going through his legal and political troubles and thinking, God, how could they ever have elected that guy? And then here we are. Frank, always fun to have you back in here. Appreciate your insights and hope you'll come back again soon.
Great talking to you. Thanks for having me on.
All righty. Take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Matty Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.